Good afternoon. Thank you for everybody joining us. We're going to give just a few more minutes for folks to hop on here before we start. All right, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Welcome to our Carbon Solutions webinar series, where we highlight the work we're doing in our company and with our partners. I'm Rachel Esch. I'm excited to have each of you join us today. Today's webinar will focus on Wyoming's carbon management and wildlife decision support tool. We will hear from experts Jessi Eidbo, Simone Stewart, and Will Schultz discussing its potential impact on wildlife conservation and carbon management. Afterwards, Sarah Kallgren from the National Wildlife Federation will moderate a discussion providing valuable insights on conservation and resource management. Please note this meeting is being recorded. You can view this presentation along with our previously recorded webinars on our YouTube channel. In addition, if you are viewing this webinar, we're excited to add you to our newsletter mailing list. We encourage you to share your thoughts, questions, and experiences in the chat. We have a dedicated time for Q&A after the presentation, but feel free to drop your questions throughout the session. Thank you again for being here. I'll pass this over to our presenters.
Thanks, Rachel, and welcome to everyone. We're really excited to have this conversation with you today. I know we have folks coming to this webinar from a couple of different professional sectors and walks of life, and so we wanted to give a really brief overview of who we are, Carbon Solutions. We're a small business, just under 30 employees as of this year, but really the core of our mission is to work towards a net zero carbon economy. We do that by partnering, across sectors with industry, government, nonprofits, researchers, and a lot of other stakeholders to think about real solutions for low carbon energy challenges. You can learn more about us at our website, which is on the bottom left. And I'll hand it over to Simone.
Thanks so much, Jessi, and thanks for everyone for coming today. So I'm Simone Stewart. I'm the Senior Industrial Policy Specialist at the National Wildlife Federation. So this project was done in collaboration with a few different organizations, and we'll go over that a little bit today. But the National Wildlife Federation started with a mission of uniting conservationists across the country. And so that's really what our organizational goal was and continues to be. And so we have a history based in natural solutions. We have 52 affiliates across the US and 2 territories, Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And as we have evolved as an organization, we recognize that conversations around climate are continuing in the global sphere and becoming more integral to include in our work around conservation. So in the last decade or so, we've had a build out at NWF that has included a climate and energy policy team. And so there's been recognition throughout the evolution of climate policy that in order to meet climate goals, we're going to need a combination of mitigation tactics to reduce the amount of CO2 or stop the amount of CO2 that we're emitting as a society, as well as carbon removal strategies to remove CO2 from the atmosphere to prevent ongoing warming of our planet. And so NWF feels that it's imperative that conservation voices and diverse voices in general are a part of shaping the narrative of what carbon management looks like in our society, which is why we participate as an organization in conversations around, of course, nature-based solutions, but increasingly more around technological and hybrid solutions. So we have a couple of examples on this slide of reports and resources that we've created to educate the public and to have in-depth policy conversations around carbon management. We also have some examples in addition to the work that we're showing today of materials that we've created with collaborators and partners. So we've done public polling and reports with Data for Progress, and we've also created some really wonderful renderings with our partners at Third Way to showcase what carbon removal might look like in society. So Jessi, if you want to go to the next slide. So really, we want to highlight the partnerships that made this project possible. So as you can see on the slide, it is a combination of working with small business like Carbon Solutions, the big nonprofit sphere like NWF, local government. So thanks to Wyoming Game and Fish for also collaborating with us, and private industry. Data Clinic was one of our partners that helped us in the beginning of this project with sourcing data that went into the actual tool. So it's, our model of policy work is about bringing diverse stakeholders to the conversation because we want to make it as meaningful as possible. Climate touches everyone, and there's so many important intersections to think about when we're talking about climate, especially as carbon management continues to build out and roll out across the country. So this project wouldn't have been possible without the unique contributions of all of these organizations. So thank you to the orgs that worked on this for helping us build this tool. And so if you go to the next slide, Jessi. Just a brief overview for what we have in store today. We're really excited that people were, willing to come to our webinar to discuss this really exciting new tool. So first, I'm going to go over some context for the development of the tool, the Wyoming Carbon Management and Wildlife Infrastructure Siting Decision Support Tool. So a mouthful, but we'll get into the nitty-gritty of what it means, why we developed something like this. And then Jessi will do a great overview for the procedure of developing the tool, as well as give a walkthrough of the tool. And then we'll wrap it up with Sarah moderating a couple of questions before taking questions from the audience to discuss a little bit more about the tool. And so if we go to the next slide. So the motivation for creating this tool is really interesting. I've been in conversation with Jessi, who works at Carbon Solutions, for a while about creating something like this. I think maybe it was a year ago that we had our initial conversation around the tool's development. Jessi, if you want to go to the next slide. The conversation around the development of a tool like this really evolved because there was recognition that there had been some discussion around conservation and the development of infrastructure like renewables. That has been happening for the last couple of decades, but there wasn't really much of a conversation happening that was related specifically to carbon management. And so we recognized a gap in this sector, and Jessi approached us since we had worked on other things before and were in conversation with each other about developing something that could close this gap. So we recognize that carbon management is becoming a more robust conversation in the climate space, especially around industrial decarbonization, where NWF was doing work, and one that's growing really rapidly due to federal investment and a maturing carbon marketplace. And so like other sectors, it was going to be imperative to answer questions around what responsible build out of carbon management looks like. And this is something that NWF has been endeavoring to think about for the last few years as we've been more involved in the industrial policy sphere in the US. And we want to ask questions and answer questions and develop resources around ideas like coexisting with the natural environment, and what does it look like for infrastructure to exist under the current climate and experiencing current climate impacts. So this really seemed like a pinpoint where project developers, policymakers and NGOs and environmental advocates could come together to have a conversation about what this infrastructure looks like, because it's going to continue to develop, and it's going to continue to develop in Wyoming. So Jessi, if you'd go to the next slide. So why Wyoming? There was no specific carbon management tool that included all the intersections that we wanted to focus on, like I said, so infrastructure, wildlife, and climate. And so we wanted to create a proofing ground for what this tool could look like in a specific locality. Originally, I think we had very high hopes of creating a tool across the entire United States, right? As many dreams start, but we felt like we had to narrow it down. And Wyoming became a place very quickly that we felt like multiple elements of our what we endeavored on existed in this one place. And so specifically around carbon management and infrastructure development, Wyoming is incredibly ripe for ongoing work here. It includes supportive state policy structures, a well-developed and storied energy history in the state with oil and gas, and good geology for sequestration. So in the carbon management space, it is a state where it made sense for development to happen. If you go to the next slide, we see that regional development is right for carbon management across the West. And that's also because of the cocktail of things that I just explained. So state and federal policy interacting with each other, energy resources, and good geology. And so if you take a look at this, at a snippet of this map that came from DOE's Connect tool that provides kind of a snapshot across the US of projects and development happening, we can see that the West is really already a place where build out around carbon management is starting to develop. And it's not just, project specific, whether it's CCS or we're talking about carbon removal, but it's the entire value chain of carbon management, all the way from transport of CO2 to its final destination, whether that's utilization or geologic storage. And so there's evidence that suggests that carbon management as a sector is building out in the West, and that Wyoming itself will become a part of a larger ecosystem of carbon management across the country. If you go to the next slide, as I said, Wyoming really stood out because of their leadership in carbon management and the variety of infrastructure that exists currently and is planning to exist in Wyoming, and the build out that we're witnessing happen across the state. So as I said, it's not just the individual projects that we're concerned with in this map, because it's not just the individual projects that matter across the ecosystem of carbon management. As I said, it's the connective tissue that brings the entire value chain together, including transport and storage. So if you go to the next slide, the last kind of intersection that we wanted to talk about with Wyoming that I mentioned is the climate and conservation lens through which Wyoming is doing a lot of work. So climate and conservation are key elements of the state of Wyoming. It's known for its natural landscapes, really important ecosystems, and dedication to wildlife habitat conservation. Wild spaces are incredibly integral to the ethos of Wyoming, what it means for the state and what it means to the population there. If you talk to anybody from Wyoming, and NWF has a robust affiliate chapter, the Wyoming Wildlife Federation, and we have several staff that work on policy that live in Wyoming, all of them have always told us at the Federation they're incredibly proud of the state and incredibly proud of what Wyoming represents as far as its natural abundance of resources. And so because of the carbon management side of things, as well as Wyoming's reputation for being this wild landscape that we want to preserve and protect, Wyoming proved to be a perfect example of a location where the nexus of all of the things that we're really interested in exploring exist in one place. So whether it's clean energy or decarbonization, we figured that if a balance could be struck between the build out of necessary climate related infrastructure and the preservation of wildlife, wild spaces, and habitats for the people and animals that live there, if we could really nail it down in Wyoming, we felt like the learnings could be replicated anywhere else. And so we're really happy to dig in more to the tool, and I'll throw it to Jessi.
Thanks, Simone. So like Simone was describing, I think there was a lot of energy, partially intended, around thinking through what type of software or platform or support we could build. The idea of putting all these things into one place felt immense at the beginning. And so this section of the webinar is just going to talk about kind of the nuts and bolts of putting the tool together. When we looked at the development process, there were a lot of people involved in this flow diagram. So we started off way, a few months ago, but with the ethos of it coming from much further before, on the data identification process. And as you'll start to see as I go through these slides, the volume of potential information is so immense. And I think that was one of the challenges in thinking through, right, we're only talking about carbon management infrastructure and we're only talking about wildlife conservation, but obviously the way that we use land and the way that infrastructure and energy gets built out considers even greater dimensions. And so our challenge to overcome became, how do we sift through this volume of information and put it in a format that's digestible and usable to practically inform the types of dialogues we were hoping to have it be of use towards. So first step was identifying all of that data. And to get there, we had a phenomenal team at NWF full of ecologists and wildlife biologists to start off with, who worked with Data Clinic, like Simone said, to pull together all of the important data sets. And that was no small amount of data, like the number of shape files and layers, but also storage. The next step was, once identified, to start collecting it. And again, that was where Data Clinic and Canyon specifically were instrumental. Not all data came from the same place. And one thing that you'll see when I go through a demo of the tool later is an ethos around this was in the back of our minds, right? Starting with Wyoming, but ensuring or hoping that there would be replicability to other geographies and maybe even the entire US. And so where and how could we rely on open and public access data to make sure that there was nothing proprietary or preventative from allowing there to be equitable use of the tool. So in getting to the third component of the development process, the QA/QC, because it was coming from so many diverse data sources, because it was coming from so many different origins, there was a lot of QA/QC that was necessary to start to harmonize the data so that we could all use it in one space. Once that was done, I say with like no small sweat on my brow, and huge thanks to Jonathan Pren from Carbon Solutions, who did a lot of that, we went into the database development phase. And so that was the conversion of the data to usable files. In some cases, one of our mechanisms for making the information accessible was to create one data set where prior there had been maybe 10. So what thread could we pull on to say that when we ask the question of what the implication of this wildlife conservation or wildlife habitat layer may be, how can we, have it have meaning to the users by combining them in creative ways. Once ready, we then, like this says, combine topically relevant layers into some user categories and put them into the tool. We grappled a little bit with what the format of this would look like, but many are likely familiar with Esri. There are also other platforms that something like this could be hosted on. We ended up going that route largely due to the accessibility factor. And because so much of what we're discussing is narrative-based and it is dialogue-driven, having the ability to embed a lot of that supportive context into and alongside the data was going to be really helpful for folks trying to use this tool. So I show this slide not to give anybody a headache, though I plead that it may give me one at this point in time, but rather to just demonstrate visually, as I was indicating, the immense volume of data that we were dealing with. So we started off by trying to isolate different key topical areas. So we had habitat, key wildlife considerations, and wildlife. And then we were playing with all of these different levels of data granularity. And so you have different types of habitat, different types of wildlife considerations, and lots of different types of wildlife. And I didn't introduce at the beginning, but I would never claim to be a wildlife expert. And so I was able to learn a lot in the process of developing this tool. But wait, there's more. And so I'm not, again, going to read through these, but just to give a sense of how much data we were playing with, but also how much opportunity something like this or this type of tool creates in being able to compile and consolidate all of these canonically disparate types of information into one interface, right? Maybe you're not often thinking about things like transportation and wildlife conservation if you're an energy developer. So how could we inform a conversation that was more diffuse in the types of considerations that were being put to paper, so to speak? So before I get into the tool itself, I wanted to give 2 caveat slides. The first is what does the tool endeavor to do? You heard a lot of the intent and motivation from Simone, but to put in one sentence, we aimed for a tool that allowed users to explore, consider, and enhance their conversations about siting carbon management infrastructure, and in this case in Wyoming, but with lessons replicable to other parts of the country. And it did that by integrating a lot of important environmental information. So it overlays current and planned carbon management infrastructure information on top of a variety of habitats, wildlife, and other critical environmental areas. It does also include climate projections, and we'll talk about a little bit more in the demo of how we think about the tenure of some of these projects. So and the tenure of these projects, not only from the asset and infrastructure component, but also from the wildlife and ecosystem component. And then it also, like I was saying, with the combinations of topically relevant information, it strives to contextualize it in a useful way. How are people thinking about these things? What types of values or other factors are informing when and how they might consider certain types of data, and how could we package it in a way that would lend itself to a natural discussion? What does the tool not do? Equally important. This tool is by no means aiming to suggest go, no-go decisions. So we do know that there are a handful of similar but not quite identical tools that suggest, here are your priority areas for build out, or here are areas where you should avoid. The intent of this tool is not to do that. It also does not propose regulatory frameworks or a right way to pursue development in the state of Wyoming. It is a complex, dynamic process to permit and site infrastructure, and there are legal implications and forces at play far beyond this tool, and it is not to suppose that this is overlaying or speaking on behalf of any type of regulatory framework, which speaks also to the third bullet. It is not intending to compete with or misrepresent any current or legal guidance on siting industrial or carbon dioxide removal technology infrastructure. That one is really important just because of the fast pace of how quickly things like legal guidance or siting policy or precedent are moving. And so making sure that this tool was built when it was built, and that there may be new information coming down the pipeline that it would not propose to compete with. It also, like I said, does not contain any proprietary or non-public data, and that was a core value of the team of us who came together to put the tool together. However, it does introduce some data limitations into what we were able to include in the tool ultimately. So with that, you can consider yourselves primed to see the tool. And I'm not sure if we had planned to, but if we want to drop the link in the chat, we can feel free to. So when it comes time for you all to visit this URL, you'll find the Wyoming Carbon Management and Wildlife Decision Support Tool. And I won't belabor it. I'll walk through this kind of briefly, but give you a snapshot of what you can encounter and kind of why we built it the way we did. So like I was saying, so much about this conversation is nuanced. It's community driven, it's values based. And so we have a pretty robust introduction that kind of walks through what we've talked through on today's webinar. Explaining that carbon management is a strategy for reducing the impacts of climate change and providing mitigation strategy. A little bit of a primer on what CCUS and CDR is. We know that there are going to be folks coming to this tool from different backgrounds and may not be as familiar with CCUS and CDR technologies. And so within the tool itself, there's a bit of an overview on what it even means to say CCUS. Someone talked about the value chain, right? The type of infrastructure that may show up on a landscape to represent that value chain looks very different depending on what part of the process you're talking about. You can even watch a video embedded in the tool. And then we give an acknowledgement to the role of conservation needs that have not been historically included in developer plans. And so, like someone was saying, we saw a lot of lessons learned with other types of energy infrastructure build out. And so how can we get ahead of this by considering all of these things up front? The how-to explains, as you navigate this, what can you expect to see? And you'll see a lot of language similar to what we just talked about. The data, as I said, was collected from publicly available sources. It was made usable for this type of a tool and also incorporated into a compendium at the end in the form of an appendix, which allows anyone using the tool to be able to access all of the data sources for themselves. And it'll take you to the raw source so you could download it if you so chose to do so. And then we get into the individual maps. And so you'll notice at the top, there's a navigation bar that allows you to choose different sections of the tool. And so they follow kind of the topically relevant sections that I was talking about or showing in that data diagram. And you're able to then navigate within to see the different data components that we incorporated for each section. So for example, the first one is just a contextual overview of the state of Wyoming. So if you're not in or from Wyoming, or maybe even if you are, there are a plentiful number of data layers that are incorporated to give the ability to navigate the state and the area associated with things like land ownership. There's different governing agencies and bodies there's a lot of federal land in Wyoming who have ownership or ability to control siting decisions on that land. And so you're able to toggle those layers on and off, and you can see where things are. So for example, if you were interested in a specific location, you could zoom in and explore the data layers for that area, or you could explore the data layer that you were specifically interested in for the entire state. You'll keep scrolling, and I won't do that much clicking for each of them, but we get into crucial and critical habitat. So we isolated a handful of layers through advisory and guidance from the wildlife biology experts and from folks with Wyoming Game and Fish, who indicated to us which areas, if we were to elevate, may be of the highest consideration for siting. And so things like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service areas of interest, critical habitat, there are a lot of habitat priorities that were identified through a planning process that the state oversaw, the development of their habitat plan. And so those are incorporated, as well as some ranges that are specific or crucial to specific species. So again, you can navigate and click on and off. And one thing I'll say before I go through the whole thing is obviously these are isolated by sectors, and one of the things we wanted to make sure we were able to do was provide a space for people to play with the data as it was of use to them. And so at the very end, there is a map, sort of a sandbox or a play box that has all of the data integrated. And so as you're going through and learning about the data that we included, you may start to posit your own inquiries about how does, this crucial winter range relate to this climate change data. And so at the bottom of the tool, you have the capability to do those type of scenario design. We have important habitat as well. We have wildlife, which contains a number of data, and Wyoming, not uniquely, but worthy of applaud, has a tremendous amount of public data available around many of their different wildlife species or habitat management areas, or other different types of specific species-specific data layers. And here's another example of where, for example, there may have been individual shapefiles associated with the seasonal range for different species, but to make this data more usable or user-friendly, just because there was so much, we integrated it into one layer of seasonal range, and you can see the distinction of the different species within that one layer. So if you keep scrolling, you can also navigate out of order. I'm obviously walking us through this chronologically, but you have the capacity to use it as you want. We have insights into recreation, so where we see people using landscapes in different ways. So for example, for hunting, or for other types of recreation like camping or fishing. We also have the climate change section, like I said, where we considered some of the longer term impacts of how we may expect to see climate changing in the state of Wyoming and across the landscape. So there were three kind of big components of this section: wildfires or fire on the landscape, precipitation, both in the form of too much or too little, so where was there drought and where was there flooding risk, and then heat, so where can we expect to see extreme temperature days or extreme hot days. And then finally, we have a lot of those sections were specific, right, to the wildlife considerations and natural landscapes. But then the presence of carbon management and energy infrastructure in the state is also very felt. And so this final map gives nod to a couple of components of the CCUS value chain. So it has the map that Simone showed with all of the current and existing projects. Those are included here for you to explore. It also has data from Carbon Solutions, actually, from outputs from some of our software tools like Concord, which estimates the potential capturable emissions from different industrial facilities across the state of Wyoming by volume. We have insights into some other CDR technologies like direct air capture. And so we have folks on staff who are working on a tool to understand where you may be able to optimize the performance efficiency of different DAC technologies. So I'll turn some of these off. But you can start to see here's where low temperature DAC systems may operate really efficiently. And here's where high temperature DAC systems may operate really efficiently. And so you can start to imagine how questions form, right? If you were to develop this here, right, what other things would you consider? And so it does this really, and skirts this balance really well, I think, of providing an ample amount of education and information, but also the freedom for people to use that to investigate questions on their own. And finally, it wraps up, like I said, with kind of this sandbox. So you can go in and have the ability to turn anything that you saw above on and off. And I will leave everyone on this webinar with the freedom to go do so on their own time. But if then so interested, there's also the appendix that links directly to all of the raw data layers. So that was a lot, I acknowledge. And I want to thank you for your attention throughout. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to provide the panel.
Thank you so much, Jessi. That was so helpful. And thank you so much, Simone, for that really great overview of NWS relationship with this ever-growing space. But hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Kallgren. I'm the Carbon Management Coordinator with the National Wildlife Federation's Climate and Energy team. And I will be moderating today's discussion on the Wyoming Carbon Management and Wildlife Decision Support Tool. So we have a few questions for the panelists. We'll monitor the Q&A box throughout. And thank you all so much for being here. So let's get started. Our first question is going to be for Will, who so graciously helped us throughout this project. He and his colleague Zach provided a really helpful expert review of all this tool. And was really just very supportive and helpful and helped us kind of think through some additional questions. But Will, the question I have for you is, how do you see developers, conservation audiences, and communities engaging with this tool on the ground in Wyoming?
Hey, thank you, Sarah. It's great to be here, and thanks for this opportunity to be involved in the development of this, as well as to be here to answer some questions. I think it starts with, where we foresee the real value of this tool is for developers to use those different layers in concert with both the potential for projects to get on the ground, but then also to be considering those important wildlife habitats in the various areas, and in some cases it's something that I think is, first of all, just to be informed that there could be those important areas, and then to follow through with either following up with our agency as to what might a particular area. There may just be stipulations on development, but it starts that conversation about, is this a place that for them should be a consideration for development. Secondly, in fact, everything is going to have some level of permitting and opportunity for public review, and so I think for the conservation groups out there, and is that this is an opportunity for them to easily be able to see what type of habitats and the extent of those habitats a particular project may be intersecting with. And so again, also provides a link to starting that conversation, with our agency about, so what are your concerns, and so forth, and so forth. So I think it's beneficial, first of all, in being proactive of examining all of the different resources, as well as here's a way to get engaged for conservation groups in evaluating these projects. I also would add that I think there's also an opportunity for agencies to even use this tool. We may have some components of those data sets, but here's a chance where they're all brought together. And so it's just certainly a tool. I can see some of our sister agencies here at the state, as well as some of the other federal agencies, being able to take advantage of it.
Yeah, that's so helpful. Thank you. I think starting the conversation, like this tool as being like a conversation starter, is really like such a goal. And I think that's a really great way of putting it. So our next question is going to be for Jessi. So all of the data in this tool was publicly accessible. There were other sources of data that were more comprehensive, especially regarding climate predictions, but they were behind like really, really steep paywalls that were not just like pay once, but like a recurring like subscription to utilize the data. And so how do you think that access to open data sources has changed over your tenure working in the data field? And how can we make this sometimes prohibitively expensive information accessible to those who would have the greatest benefit from engaging with it?
Yeah, I think that's such a topical question. I'll speak first to the maybe navigation we've seen. Obviously, data science and specifically geospatial data has come so far so fast. Even in the conversation we had around choosing the platform for this tool, we had so many more options than 5-10 years ago would have ever been on the table. So I think in that regard, we've seen tremendous advances. We also see more and more that agencies are hosting and housing their own data, which creates opportunity for greater accessibility, transparency, and public access to it. And I think to the second part of the question, we all agree that without the back-end information, it's really hard to make informed decisions. And so the hope is that in every effort, the more often we can shed light on ensuring that data is open access and publicly available, we can encourage folks to use it. And I think tools like this are really valuable because it shows that even with what we have available to us now, despite, like you were saying, there was some more granular data, but it did come at a cost. And so we turned away from it. But this is still an extremely helpful tool. And it could be interesting to watch as folks use this type of tool or make their own or pursue data-driven decision-making and insights if we aren't encouraged to see more open access associated with a demand that increases when folks see and feel the power of having data at their hands. They're likely to want more of it.
Yeah, I certainly relate to that. I think when we found some of this stuff, it was really astonishing just how broad spectrum all of these things showed. And I think it was the data from the Wyoming wildlife stuff in particular is from the Natural Resources Explorer tool from the Wyoming state government, and it was just such a cool tool to play around with. And I encourage everybody to take a look at that tool as well as our own.
Can I add something to that, Sarah, while we have a second? I think, Jessi, that was a really fantastic answer, and we're really grateful to our partners once again at Data Clinic and Carbon Solutions. And Sarah herself did a really amazing job diving into the available tools and resources to really create what we have here. I think I also, when I think about data, I think that tools like this are also a really great opportunity for community science and citizen science, and really thinking about that being a bridge to connect people to what's happening in their state, what's happening either from the wildlife perspective or the carbon management perspective. And so, there's a lot of endeavors already existing where people in the public are collecting data that goes into databases related to wildlife and biodiversity. NWF is home to some really amazing birders who I know all over the country are contributing to databases and logging information about the environment around them. So that's also something that kind of came to mind while we were thinking about this is, we were getting these, the data from all different kinds of sources, but what would it look like to create something where communities are able to access and provide input and help kind of shape that changing landscape as it evolves is a really also interesting way to think about tools like this.
Yeah, that's a great point, Simone. Thank you for sharing that.
And there, can I 100% agree. And to give, I think, further credit to folks like Wyoming for putting together. I mean, I know there's like a rough and tumble team back at the state who are just manning a tremendous volume of data. And I think one of the things that we ran into in attempting to harmonize from disparate data sources across one static geography, and we know that this is an issue, right? Not just with all data, but when we think about people-driven data too, like the census, and how there are so many folks in so many types of communities that maybe aren't represented, or we can't rely solely on that, but there just isn't better data. I hope that, or I think what we learned from this was the excitement at being able to empower folks to, like you're saying, Simone, be the goalkeepers of their own data. So just really, really wanted to echo that. I think it was really important in this process.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was really amazing. So for the next question, I'm going to start with Will, and then Simone, maybe you can jump in after. How do you think we should reconcile the competing needs for clean energy and decarbonization infrastructure, and also prioritize conservation during the climate and biodiversity crises?
Great question, right? I guess I would look at it, not from the standpoint of really competing needs. We need both of those, right? And so, what I think it does open up some opportunity. Here in Wyoming, of course, our direction is when it comes to energy development is an all of the above. And so in addition to our more traditional, coal-fired electricity, natural gas, certainly, we are rapidly becoming home to a lot of wind facilities, solar facilities, and so as well as uranium production. And we'll be looking at a reactor here in Wyoming, potentially in the next couple of years. And so, looking at that broad spectrum of energy sources and obviously sources for carbon dioxide, I think there's some opportunity there. We certainly realize that we can do it better, with those more traditional fossil fuels. And so I think there's some opportunity there for some partnerships to be developed and so forth. And so I think that's really important, that we don't just totally close the door, because I think there definitely is some opportunity there. And then, with regard to conservation, I feel very fortunate that I work in a state that not only has an incredible wildlife resource and open spaces, we have some incredibly enthusiastic and passionate people about wildlife. And when I look at even the consideration of wildlife in development here in Wyoming, compared to some of my colleagues that I work with in other states, and the lack of opportunity to at least recognize even, important wildlife habitats, I feel very fortunate. And so I don't have any concern that conservation is always going to be, it will be considered as we move forward.
Yeah, I
Thank
think
you. That was great. Go ahead, Simone.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think Will, did an amazing job kind of addressing the landscape that exists in Wyoming. And I think really what I would like to highlight is the coming together portion of what Will said. I think sometimes the stereotype on either side, whether for developer, for conservationist, is sort of like, oh, you hate to see the other one coming a little bit. And I think that there's really good examples that Will had shared with us on other calls of both areas being considerate of each other, that the conservation community recognizing that this development is to benefit climate, which will have impacts on wildlife and biodiversity, hopefully in a positive direction, and also for developers to really recognize the work that the conservation and wildlife community is doing, and take it seriously in order to protect not only the ethos of a place like Wyoming, but protect the ecologically important aspects of the state too. And I think working together, as Will said, is what's possible, and I hope to see some more of in the future. There's a lot of kind of the permitting side of things for projects as they move forward, require environmental assessments and require going through, NEPA protocols, and I see opportunity there for bringing these agencies in early on to have these conversations. Will gave us a really great example when we were having a conversation prior to this call about developers working on a solar farm, fencing all the way around, and how quick it was for Game and Fish to say, well, the mesh size of your fencing is enough for a pronghorn antelope doe to get her head stuck in, and how easy something like that comes to Wyoming Game and Fish with the deep expertise that they have, something that could have easily been a phone call or, a quick visit to the site. And so the earlier these collaborations can start, I think the better for both sides they can be. And so I hope to see the pulling in of these agencies or community science, like we brought up earlier, by developers to even maybe bolster some of these data sources. There's monitoring and reporting that has to happen for these projects anyway. And that's a big something that, the groups on this call have always been big proponents for, the MRV component of carbon management. And so as that monitoring is happening in a technological sense, there's also abundant opportunity for that monitoring to include ecological and biodiversity data. So if you're partnering with the existing organizations, whether they're agencies or groups like Wyoming Wildlife Federation, our affiliate in the state, it's a great opportunity for developers to come together with folks that have this incredible knowledge, specifically that is localized, to report information that is really important to the state and important to other developers as the build out continues. We want to create not disparate projects, but an overall vision for the state. And it's going to take more than just individual project developers and one-off conversations with agencies to do that.
And Sarah, if it's okay, this is just one of the things I get really jazzed about, and thank you both, Will and Simone, for articulately summing up so much of what I think is important. The final thing would almost be to add, I think what we saw happen with, as Simone gave nod, renewable energy, is that development occurred in the way that development has for a really long time. And then it was sort of a belated, oh, if we did X differently, we could achieve win-wins, or we could embed co-benefits. And one of the things I'm so excited about is the nascency or the youth of a lot of the CDR technologies, in that there's a ton of, and here's the plea to engineers and to our techno experts, how can we proactively build these technologies in a way that builds in the win-wins or builds in the types of co-benefits, and prevents, mitigates the harm that they may potentially pose. Obviously, a lot of CCUS infrastructure has been around and operating for a long time, and we know what's going on there. But with emergent technologies like direct air capture, where some of the site level configurations are maybe still open-ended, I just urge our, the folks way smarter than me to start asking themselves those questions and how we can build these types of strategies into the design itself, because I think there's a ton of potential there, which goes back to partnerships, right?
Yeah, thank you all. That's so helpful. I think something that we hear so much when we talk about community engagement and stuff is that like early and often strategy that you want to be implementing. And I think it's such a good policy to implement across all partnerships on these types of projects. So for my last question, we're going to have one for all the panelists, and we'll keep it relatively quick so we can save time for any Q&A questions from the audience. But how can mapping tools like these help to create more informed policy and engagement strategies? And we can start with Will.
Yeah, so I'll keep it short. I think it just really can start to again get people thinking about where these potential projects could be and the what concerns may be on that landscape. And one thing I would add is that, of course, with the data sets that you're using from the Game and Fish, obviously there's a large emphasis on like our big game species because of course it's a large component of our management, and where we tend to have less data, of course, are our non-game species, and that is where being able to fortify that information with the work from birders, e-birding, and so forth, can also lend itself to this we may not have any impacts for those large ungulates and so forth, but it's the little guys we got to need to think about and so forth. And so I think, that's part of that combination is thinking about legislation, thinking about permitting and regulatory is just thinking more than, deer and antelope and a necessary time of the year, right? Think about their entire ranges. So as we used to focus very heavily on winter range for our mule deer, and the more that we started looking at more nutritional metrics and so forth, we found how important summer range can be for those does that are lactating. And when they're coming off the summer range, they're carrying their groceries on their back. We say that a lot, and so having a tool like this can certainly start, that thought process about, it may be summer range for mule deer, but there's a lot of other things living there as well.
I'll just once again highlight for me as a person who works in the policy sphere and has the conversation both at the federal and state level. Oftentimes, I think we really have to start getting in a planning mode as far as what this build out is going to look like. DOE has done a really wonderful job of doing project awards and doing some great mapping of their own to really figure out what regions are starting to look like. I think especially in a place like Wyoming that has Class 6 primacy and is able to permit geologic storage wells at the state level, it's going to be increasingly important to really start looking at the big picture of what carbon management expansion is going to look like in the state, rather than looking at individual projects as they start popping up and looking at them as more disparate pieces. I think that kind of large scale planning, whether it's corridors or it's storage basins, is going to be really important for what Will said, to consider wildlife as a whole and looking at this larger landscape beyond big game and looking at very specific regions in the state. I think that it's sort of an ongoing iterative process that then, as developers and policy starts expanding to look at the state, then that will inform how Game and Fish and Wyoming Wildlife Federation are able to do their work at a state level, and so on in this iterative process. So that's my kind of plea and call for policy, is to start really thinking on a larger scale.
And I'll dovetail that with the other end of that spectrum. And I think, to echo, Will, the point you made, right? We think a lot about, and it's a metaphor at this point, but the big ungulates, and maybe not so often about the little guys. And while we understand, and Simone, you're absolutely right, the urgency to think regionally and basin scale about the way that this infrastructure is going to be built out is going to be critical to an efficient system. But at the same time, we know so much siting authority still rests in the hands of local communities. And so I think one of the hopes I have for a tool like this is to empower, like we were talking about, we said community-driven data, and local zoning is kind of the unsung policy decider in many of these infrastructure decisions. And so how can we, and I'm eager to find out the impact that this tool has in Wyoming across the local communities and local governing authorities and Native nations, with helping them inform and have dialogue about where and how this type of infrastructure can provide benefit, but where they may be less interested in citing it. Because we know from precedent, like the Wyoming Pipeline Corridor Initiative, that when planning is done, as Simone is indicating, in advance, to say, we want it here, right? It makes everything a whole heck of a lot easier on the development side to bring a project forward, and to know that that value-based discussion has already occurred. So I think I like the marriage of the two.
That was great. If y'all could do all that like right now, that'd be so great. Just get it done.
One thing I'd like to build off Simone's comment a little bit is I totally agree, and I'm so glad that you hit on planning and looking at things on a larger scale than project by project is very important. And it's also important, again, as you both mentioned, to look at more of that local level, though. And that is one thing I think there's an opportunity at a larger scale, at a federal level, to provide some framework. I do think that there's also opportunity to make those decisions, if it's at a federal level that, the decisions are made, the record of decisions are made at a state level to help customize that at that level at least, and then we can start looking at even more local levels like counties and so forth. So.
All right, thank you guys so much. This was a super interesting discussion, and I appreciate all three of your expertises. Now I think I opened the Q&A box, and I'm seeing one question. I can read that out real quick if that's helpful. So this is from Shannon Heck-Williams. Though this isn't a go, no-go tool, would you say that the overlay of these data sets do show some potential areas for responsible development with regards to wildlife? Or do you think that a robust prioritization exercise would be next necessary by decision makers to ID best siting options, or both?
I'm happy to jump in and wonder if we're all thinking the same thing. Both feels great. But we did, in the development of this tool, I think we had a lot of discussion about what the second component of the question is getting at. Obviously, we're giving people a lot of information and a lot of data, and some of that data, by its nature, despite what we say or don't say, coincides. And the implication of that, I think, what is somewhat absent in the tool. Spare discussion at the end to give nod to the fact that even though there may be areas you might want to avoid less or more, there's also ways to do the development that could provide direct benefit in the form of, and I'll give an example, not actually from carbon management, so I recognize that, but what we saw with solar, right? There was a lot of opportunity with certain types of solar development to cultivate native pollinator habitat, for example, something that on the landscape has very little economic value, but by combining that with solar, you gave a financially viable route to the use of that landscape for a habitat benefit. And so I think those types of discussions are just still so new to much of the carbon management space that the opportunity to explore would be like an ideal next step. But I don't know if Simone or Will have more to add. I love the question.
I guess I'll jump in and say that, one of the things, is with regard to even within some of those very important habitats, there can be opportunities for siting on already previously disturbed sites and so forth. And fortunately, carbon sequestration, a lot of the network is in place from gas and oil development. And so, there's a case there where looking for those opportunities where we're not adding more disturbance on the landscape, but keeping it centralized to those already disturbed locations.
Yeah, thank you. That's super helpful. We had one question in the chat a bit ago that asked, sorry, can you identify any current and proposed CO2 pipeline routes in Wyoming? And I'm assuming that's in the mapping tool. And yes, we do have the pipeline routes in the mapping tool that you'll be able to explore. Now I think we're approaching time. So I think that said, I think we can turn it back to Rachel or Veronica. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all our panelists. Thanks, Sarah, for hosting some of those questions there. I will give just 30 seconds to a minute here for any final questions for folks. Please drop it in the chat at this time. I also put the link to the tool there for anybody who would like to explore it a little bit on your own time. Feel free to check that out.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Like to set an awkward silence just to make sure we didn't miss anyone. All right. I'll let you guys go. Thank you so much for your time. Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone.